So let's start. Okay. I'm Mike Ehrman. I'm president of the Squirrel Historical Society. We have a bunch of new faces here. Welcome. We have a bunch of old faces here. Welcome back. Hope you all had a good summer. We are a membership organization, and therefore we invite you to join us. Anyone who joins from here on will actually be joining for the full next year, since we only have a couple of months left to go. I will mention, and we'll describe it more fully in our new literature, the membership fees for next year are going up to $15 for individuals and $25 for couples, plus any other donations, contributions you want to make. We're a 501c3, and therefore all of that is deductible. Okay, so these meetings are free and open. You can come as many times as you want without being a member, but we welcome members. This is a volunteer organization, and I would like to introduce the officers of the group, starting with Helen Wilson, who's one of our two vice presidents. Helen will be up in a minute to talk about a couple of things. Betty Connolly is our other vice president. She unfortunately lost her husband last week, a dear friend of ours, and we don't expect her here tonight. We have a board, and our treasurer, Evelyn Young, is on her way back from Canada tomorrow morning. No, from New York tomorrow morning, so she's not here tonight. Audrey Glickman manning the camera, a board member, should be up in a minute too. Ralph Lund is here, a board member. Jim Hammond is here, a board member. Toby Chapman, another one of our board members, is not here tonight. I don't think I've missed any of our board members, have I? I don't want to insult anyone. Patty Hughes in the back is our webmaster, as well as greeter on these meetings. We hold meetings every month except August. You have a schedule, but just to mention briefly, next month we're going to have the Squirrel Hill Urban Coalition. In November, we're going to have a speaker, a professor from, I think, St. Francis, talking about two historic basketball players who come from the neighboring communities here. He's written a book about this, and he's going to come speak to us. And then in December, Glenn Green, who has a stained glass studio over in Regent Square, is going to come and talk about his business and about stained glass in general. And he does marvelous work, so that should be a good one. We have most of our schedule for next year, but I'll have you read that rather than taking the time. I'd like Audrey to come up for a minute to tell you about a neighborhood event that's coming up, and then Helen will do the same.
Thank you, Mike. The Greenfield Bridge celebration, it says in the back of my shirt, will be October 17th. It will run from 4 o'clock to midnight. There are t-shirts just like mine for sale at the Staghorn Cafe on Greenfield Avenue. They cost $15. And it's a big celebration. Joe Grishecki is going to play. He's going to play on the grass, not on the bridge, because parts might fall off of the bridge. And there's more information available at gcapgh.org/bridge. And you can ask me any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Helen?
That's actually a good segue into what I'm going to say, because on September 19th, Saturday, is the 7th annual Turner Cemetery History Walk, which longtime members might know that's one of my projects, is helping research that little old graveyard that contains the remains of the earliest settlers of Squirrel Hill. And we know a lot about the settlers now and about the area, and the speaker. We have a speaker every year. The speaker will be my son, and he and I have just finished writing an Arcadia book on Pittsburgh's bridges. including the Greenfield Bridge, or the Beechwood Boulevard Bridge is its original name. So the book is coming out in October. So anyway, there's flyers back there, and if you are a member, there was information about that in the newsletter of the History Walk, and you can also ask me about it. We'll have reenactors camping out Friday nights, so that's from the 8th Pennsylvania Regiment. And we sell soup and have a bake sale because Methodist, you know. So anyway, that was one thing. And the second, got to have a bake sale. Second thing was, if you get the newsletter, you notice that we have a member, Wayne Bossinger, who is contributing articles. He's researching Squirrel Hill and contributing articles to the newsletter, and every one of you who's a member is invited, if you're doing Squirrel Hill research, especially about Squirrel Hill names, to send us your research and we'll publish it. And I think at some point we were trying to decide how the researchers could meet and talk instead of just email back and forth. And we're toying with the idea of meeting 15 minutes earlier than the regular meeting and just talking about the research and where we are. So we're going to try that for next month and see how that works. So if you're interested in doing research about Squirrel Hill, Wayne's article next time is about a mineral water spa that he discovered in Squirrel Hill. So it's going to be an interesting article. So thank you.
So that's at 7:15 in our October meeting. Okay? We're very fortunate in the Historical Society to have started to generate a pipeline of volunteers who want to speak to us. Used to be we had to work hard to get our speakers. We've always been very lucky with our speakers, but we had to work for it. Now we get volunteers, and tonight our speaker is one of those. Elizabeth Williams-Herrman, who I understand is a native of Greenfield, and who then went on to study at first at Roche College and then get a master's degree at Duquesne in history, has written a book on World War I Pittsburgh's side of the story, which, by the way, is available for sale. It's $25? $20 here tonight, if you'd like to. And Elizabeth is going to come up and talk to us about the important role Pittsburgh played in World War I. Thank you for coming.
Good evening. First, I'd like to thank you guys for having me. I'm really excited to be here, and I hope I don't bore you all too much. Because I'm here to talk about Pittsburgh and World War I. First, I'm going to give a brief introduction to World War I, and then I'm going to talk about what this has to do with Pittsburgh, because, believe it or not, Pittsburgh is not the first thing anybody thinks about when they think about World War I. Right. And then I'm going to talk about our industries and our commitment to the war effort. I'm going to focus particularly on the Red Cross, because Pittsburgh had the largest Red Cross chapter in the entire country by the end of April of 1917. We were double the size of New York City's, and we were a very active Red Cross chapter. So that's mainly what I'm going to focus on. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about one of the homegrown organizations committed to war work, called the Mothers of Democracy. I'm also going to talk about the German community a little bit, because we had a very, very strong German community in Pittsburgh and how the war affected them. And lastly, I'm going to talk about Pittsburghers overseas. Particularly, I'm going to talk about William Thaw, who was the first American airman in the war. He actually was flying for France before the United States entered the war. I'm also going to talk about Thomas Enright, who was one of the first 3 American casualties of the war. Otto von Bismarck once said, "One day the great European war will come out of some foolish thing in the Balkans." And he was right. Otto von Bismarck was the Chancellor of Germany who died in 1898. He was responsible for the unification of Germany, and he basically predicted World War I. Because as you probably know, World War I began with the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand and his wife Sophia in the summer of 1914. 6 weeks after the Archduke's death, the continent erupted into war. America, for its part, really wanted to stay out of what was seen as a strictly European conflict and declared its neutrality. The stance of neutrality for America couldn't last for several reasons. Foremost, from the very beginning of the war, as I'll talk about later, from 1914, 1915, the United States was economically tied with the Allied powers, with England and France, against the Central Powers. We now had an economic stake in who won the war. Now, how does Pittsburgh fit into this? According to the 1910 census, Pittsburgh was the 8th largest city in the United States. Pittsburgh was already producing 36% of America's steel by 1912. So we were already a go-to industrial force by the time World War I broke out. Which means that on December 30th, 1914, when the British government needed 3 million shells, they turned to the Westinghouse Corporation. And the Westinghouse Corporation became the first American company to receive a war contract from any of the Allied powers. Westinghouse accepted this contract even though they had no idea how to make war materials or shells. They could only use 2% of the tools which they currently had in the factory, meaning that they not only had to build new tools and machinery, but undaunted by this, the company managed to fill the order in 45 days.
Wow.
Because of Westinghouse's early success, the Allied powers turned to more Pittsburgh companies, and by the time the United States entered the war in April of 1917, Pittsburgh already had 250 war plants dedicated to war work. These plants were open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and 500,000 Pittsburghers were already employed in making war materials. One Allied general, and in case you're wondering what Allied general, I could find about 1 billion sources that quoted this man. Nobody ever named him. But one Allied general said, "Pittsburgh steel is everywhere along the battlefield." Pittsburgh not only made steel, we made bullets, we made glass for the sights and the guns. Excuse me. Basically, if an Allied nation needed it, Pittsburgh figured out how to make it here. And then when America entered the war, we made war materials for America too. By May of 1918, the New York Times reported that it was impossible for a new buyer to get steel from Pittsburgh unless they had connections inside the mill or they had special government-issued credentials. And by the end of the war, Westinghouse estimates that its American contracts totaled over $214 million. And that's just one company. and Carnegie Steel, U.S. Steel, Pittsburgh Plate and Glass, Carbon Steel, pretty much you name it. Every single company in Pittsburgh pretty much was engaged in World War. I really, really like this quote because it really sums up the industrial role that Pittsburgh took during the war. It's from the Christian Science Monitor in 1917. They describe Pittsburgh as, "It is not merely an industrial city, it is a city of stupendous industries. It is a city of furnaces, of rolling mills, of foundries, a plate-making city, a huge arsenal upon which all of the nations fighting for humanity, civilization, and democracy are today drawing largely for their supplies. And Pittsburgh is one of the numerous things which the High Command of Germany overlooked when it set the world on fire." I like this quote for a couple of reasons. Number one, it really does sum up for me what Pittsburgh was doing during the war on the industrial side. And it also, I really, really like the language of the quote because it is so indicative of the time period. Pittsburgh, the German High Command didn't just declare war. It set the world on fire. And this really intense language is very indicative of the time period, as I'll cover later. And you'll see that even in the loyalty oath that Pittsburghers took. Mere days before the United States entered the war in April of 1917, people were getting nervous, and we really didn't know whether or not the United States was going to enter the war. It was looking like the United States was going in that direction, but nobody was 100% sure. So the city held a citywide meeting, which the Pittsburgh Press estimates was attended by 10,000 people. And after listening, and these people listened to various patriotic speeches, all of these speeches urged preparedness. They urged that nobody knew whether or not the United States was going to enter the war, but if they did, Pittsburgh and America had to be prepared. A lot of the speeches said that we had been a soft nation, untouched by war, and that we needed to steel ourselves for the upcoming battle against the barbarian Huns, because that's how the Germans were beginning to be portrayed as less than human. And at the end of the meeting, everybody in the meeting took an oath of loyalty to the United States. They said, recognizing clearly that the cherished ideals of liberty and justice in this country and the moral foundations of life and self are threatened with destruction by foreign enemies, do voluntarily and wholeheartedly offer to the President and the government of the United States my loyal support in this coming crisis. Now, the language of this says that there wasn't a whole lot of wiggle room. It's very much, you're either with us or against us. And that by 1917 is how many people in Pittsburgh felt. And many people in Pittsburgh wanted to do everything that they could to help in the coming crisis. As I said before, our Red Cross chapter barely existed prior to April of 1917. By the end of that month, it was the largest in the country, twice the size of the New York City's. Volunteers, mostly women and immigrants, because volunteering for the Red Cross was a great way to prove that you were a loyal American and that you were loyal to the United States in the war. They worked in a number of areas, one of which was the supply department. Every month, the National Red Cross would issue the amount of completed goods that each chapter had to produce. And they were things like frontline packets full of bandages for the soldiers, stuff like that. Pittsburgh always exceeded the quotas that the National Red Cross issued for them, even if work in the supply department was anything but cheerful or easy. Sometimes Red Cross standards would switch halfway through completing an order, and these women would have to start again. Every packet was inspected. If anything was done not according to national standards, it had to be redone. Women worked in complete silence. The only time that they could pause in their work was at noon for prayer, and this was done on a completely volunteer basis. Knitting drives were also extremely important to the Red Cross. Sweaters were needed to keep the boys overseas warm. What's interesting is the sweater drive is something that the Red Cross thought at the time that they did wrong, because what they would do is they would issue, they would tell women to knit sweaters. The needles were provided, but the yarn was not. And so women would spend months and months knitting sweaters, and then they'd get letters from their husbands and sons overseas that said that they hadn't received the Red Cross sweater. And then these women got angry and went back to the Red Cross and said, why am I doing this for people I don't even know when my son hasn't gotten his sweater yet? After that, the Red Cross started issuing sweaters when boys enlisted, before they were shipped out. Children were also a fundamental part of the Red Cross's work. Nearly every school in the city of Pittsburgh, whether it was public or private, was part of the Junior Red Cross. There were 90,000 Junior Red Cross members by Christmas of 1917. In order to become an auxiliary of the Junior Red Cross, every student in the school needed to pledge either to donate a quarter or do volunteer work. Every school in the city promised to do both. In poorer neighborhoods where kids couldn't afford to bring in the quarter, fundraisers were held so that the kids could furnish the donations. And the Junior Red Cross was great for the government because it allowed the government to teach the kids food rationing standards so that they would then enforce them at home. And if they didn't, their teachers would go make house calls and make sure that their parents, these kids were making their parents follow the U.S. government regulation standards. These kids also typically worked in a school garden, and they typically made things, depending on their age, they would make things for either the soldiers overseas or refugee children overseas. The older kids learned how to play patriotic songs for each of the allied nations to keep the spirits up, while the other kids worked. Now I'm going to talk a little bit, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the Mothers of Democracy. The Mothers of Democracy were founded by Ellen Alderdice, which, considering we are in Squirrel Hill, Alderdice is a very familiar name here. That was Taylor Alderdice's wife. She had sons overseas, and she thought it was important for mothers to be able to have a place where they could gather and they could share, not private information, but public information about where their sons were, and they could keep each other's spirits up when during the war. The Mothers of Democracy it was founded in 1918, and it became quite a powerful local organization. They would have people like the mayor speak at their meetings, and generally anybody who came to Pittsburgh who was deemed important enough would speak at their meetings. After the war, they continued to exist for a few years. They worked to get the back pay of soldiers, and they also had a very interesting project. They helped house what they called American War Orphans. These were children whose fathers had died in the war and whose mothers, for whatever reason, couldn't take care of them or had been institutionalized because of grief. The Mothers of Democracy took these kids in and found them homes. They were very, very proud that they had managed to convince one rich woman who had considered adopting a dog to take a child instead. But their heart was in the right place, I suppose. That's not to say that every Pittsburgher supported the war effort. We were a very big city, we were a very diverse city. However, by the time April of 1917 rolled around, anything but 100% Americanism was not tolerated very well. Consider on April 16th, 1917, a man named Theodore Kosman. He was 50 years old and he owned the Wonderland movie theater on Penn Avenue. He stood outside of his theater and he made an anti-war speech. His remarks turned a crowd of several hundred against him. Riot police dispersed the crowd and arrested Kosman. He was charged with a misdemeanor and held on $10,000 bond because he had incited a riot. This was not good enough for some. Word spread where he was being held, and another mob formed outside of there. And police had to break up that mob because they wanted to dish out some vigilante justice. A few days later, a Homestead man named John Herrmann, who was a proud Austrian citizen, wore a picture of the Kaiser on his jacket and proudly declared his love for Austria. I'm sure you can guess how this is going to end. John Malzoch, another Homestead man, overheard him, and when Herrmann said that he would be going back to Austria to fight for Germany, Malzoch beat him severely. Both men were arrested and charged with disorderly conduct, but only Herrmann, the Austrian citizen, was punished. Malzoch was praised for dealing with the German sympathizers so effectively. The local burgess told him persons insulting the American flag could have the stuffings beaten out of them. You did right. So these intensely pro-Allied power feelings put the local Pittsburgh German community in a bit of a pickle. Because we did have a huge German community. This is just one example. This is the Smithfield Street Evangelical Church, which was a German church. It's still there, actually. It's right across from Wiener World in downtown. But once upon a time in 1914, all of these businesses were German owned. The church owned this entire block, and they only rented to German businesses, creating a small German business community, and it was one of many in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh had not only first-generation German Americans, but second and third generation who still spoke German at home and still had strong ties to the fatherland. Now, when World War I first broke out, these German communities, it was completely okay to support and talk about your support for your homeland in the war. They even raised money for German Austro-Hungarian relief and held fundraisers. And actually, the very beginning of the war, the German community in Pittsburgh was much more concerned about prohibition than it was about the war in Europe. And there was a greater American, all over America, the German community was in a tight spot because of the war, because of prohibition, and there were calls to assimilate and stop speaking German. Pittsburgh didn't have so much of that here because there was such a large German-American community. It was more considered that it would just die out eventually as people became, as further generations became more Americanized. I mean, there were definitely nativists here, but it was nothing compared to cities like Chicago. But, you know, the German-American community was concerned and was allowed to be concerned with supporting Germany in the war, especially as time went on. However, as time went on, what they failed to really realize was the general Anglo-American viewpoint towards Germany and towards the war was shifting due to things like what happened in Belgium, and most specifically, the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915. The Lusitania had been a British passenger liner that was torpedoed by German U-boats in 1915. The mainstream American press, and Americans were on board the ship. Several lost their lives. The mainstream American press was absolutely shocked and appalled that the Germans would dare torpedo a ship that Americans were on, and that Americans had been killed on the Lusitania. The Pittsburgh German community was not quite on the same, was not quite in sync with the mainstream American press on this. Their initial reporting in the Volksblatt on Freiheitsfront, and I'm sorry, any of you speak German. I do not. I did the best I could. But that was the local German, one of the two German-American newspapers in Pittsburgh. Their initial reaction to the Lusitania was to praise German military prowess that they had managed to sink this ship. When they realized that the mainstream American press was reacting a bit differently, they then began to defend Germany. They said that, the German government had put out notices that you should not board a British passenger liner in times of war. They were considered fair targets. So the Volksblatt said that any American going on that ship knew that they could be torpedoed out of the water, they could die. And the Volksblatt also made the claim that the ship had been carrying munitions bound for Britain, which it ended up, it was carrying British munitions as well as Canadian soldiers. What the Volksblatt and many in the German-American community failed to realize is none of that was going to matter when Americans were dead. This had given, the sinking of the Lusitania had given many people who were hoping that America would go to war against Germany ammunition. As the United States marched closer to war with Germany over the course of the next 2 years, the German-American community really had to learn to keep their opinions to themselves. Shortly before the United States entered the war, the Volksblatt ran an editorial that said, "Silence is golden. If you don't talk about your support for Germany, nobody can arrest you, nobody can harass you." Throughout, from 1917 until the end of the war, the German-American community was spied on by the U.S. government and others Some people were arrested, but we never had the widespread violence here and the decimation of the German community here that we had, that happened in other communities like Chicago throughout America. It's also worth noting that after the war, the German community in Pittsburgh managed to rebound and it managed to thrive again, pretty much up until World War II. We were one of the few communities that managed to maintain both of its newspapers, both of its German newspapers after the war. By the 1920s, German surnames in Pittsburgh were considered normal and Anglo. And companies like the German Beneficial Union, during the war they had become the Beneficial Union. After the war, they went back to German Beneficial Union, up until World War II. When they dropped the German the second time, they became the Greater Beneficial Union, and they still exist out in the South Hills on Brownsville Road. Lastly, I'm going to shift my focus a little bit and talk about Pittsburghers who served overseas during the war. 60,000 men from Allegheny County entered the service. Pictured here is a group of Pittsburgh soldiers parading down Smithfield Street, and the crowds that bade them farewell to some of the first Pittsburgh men to ship out in September of 1917. Out of the 60,000, a little over 1,000 didn't return home. I'm going to highlight two of them. William Thaw was born in 1893, and he was born into one of Pittsburgh's most prominent and wealthy families. If any of you are familiar with Harry Kendall Thaw and the Girl in the Red Velvet Swing, William was his nephew. William's family had a whole lot of money and a whole lot of influence, not only in Pittsburgh but nationally. His grandfather was a railroad tycoon, a coal baron, a banker, and a philanthropist, and his father was a prominent businessman. While William was attending Yale University, he developed a love for aviation and obtained his pilot license. In 1913, he decided to drop out of college. When he dropped out of college, he convinced his father to reward him by buying him a hydroplane. And his father agreed. And so William spent about a year flying around the country and offering people rides in his plane. And that's how he made a living. By the spring of 1914, his younger brother Alex had invented an automatic stabilizer for heavy planes. This invention was chosen to represent the Aero Club of America in a contest held in France that summer. And as you know, the summer of 1914 was not a good time to be in France. They were there when the war broke out, and the contest was canceled. Alex and his mother and his sister all went back to America. William, however, stayed. He said that he loved France and he hated Germany, and he wanted to be a part of the last great war of civilization, which was going to be one for freedom against barbarism. So he donated his plane to the French, and he said, "I want to fly for you." The French were a little bit wary of this. They barely had enough planes to go around to their own pilots, much less some American kid who was willing to betray his own country's neutrality for them. They were a little bit suspicious. They thought he could be a German spy. So William joined the French Foreign Legion and discovered very quickly that getting shot at wasn't a lot of fun or very exciting. He considered dodging streetcars in Brooklyn more exciting than getting shot at. He did really well in the French Foreign Legion, and he ended up getting command very quickly. However, he found out that a Lieutenant Brocard of his was stationed about 20 miles away from where he was. And so he went AWOL in the French Foreign Legion. And to hike those 20 miles, talk to this Lieutenant Brocard, and ask him to get transferred into the French Aviation Service. His ploy worked, and Brocard heard him out and actually got him transferred into the French Aviation Service. And in mid-December of 1914, along with Americans James Bach and Bert Hall, Bach and Hall couldn't fly as well as Thaw. So, as a result, on December 23rd, 1914, he became the first American pilot accepted into the French Aviation Service, and eventually he would earn the Moniker American Eagle. He did so well that when he died, the French actually had, and he died in the 30s, the French actually had a flyover of their war monuments in memory of William Thaw, their Great World War I monument. He was cited several times for his bravery by the French and later by the Americans once he was transferred over to the American Aviation Service. He also helped create the Lafayette Squadron, which was the American squadron in the French Flying Corps. He helped create that in 1916. Later that year, Thaw decided that the squadron needed a mascot. And I don't know if you can make it out, but he's actually holding a lion cub. He purchased the lion cub from a Brazilian dentist and named him Whiskey. Eventually there would be 2 lion cubs. There would be Whiskey and Soda. When they got to be about the size of small dogs, they scared people outside of the squadron. So they were made to donate them to the Paris Zoo. However, Whiskey and Soda never forgot their former owners. After the war, Thaw went to visit them, and he reached his hand in the cage, which freaked the zookeepers out, and Whiskey and Soda rolled over for belly rubs. Thomas Enright, in my mind, is the side of William Thaw in a number of ways. He was born in Lawrenceville on May 8, 1877, to working-class Irish Catholic parents. He was their 7th child and the first born in the United States. He attended St. Mary's Catholic School in Lawrenceville. 20-year-old Enright joined the Army in 1909, becoming a member of the 26th Cavalry. In 1916, when his tour ran out, he re-enlisted in the 16th Infantry. Enright's Company F would be the first American troops to see action on November 3, 1917, in what became known as the Falmouth Raid. At about 10 p.m. the night before, Company F relieved the French troops in the Quiet Sector, protecting the city of Nancy, France. The German lines were about 500 yards from the American trenches. The Americans had no way of knowing that the Germans were completely aware of their presence and their movements. The Germans had been informed by a French deserter through a system of signals from the town of Falmouth. Enright was posted as a sentry along the lines, along with Private Merrill D. Hay. The silence was broken at about 3 in the morning by the sound of German artillery. The Germans continued to shell for 45 minutes. And during the shelling, the German troops actually crawled underneath the gunshots right up to the American trenches without being spotted. They were ready to strike the moment the shelling stopped. 40 Americans found themselves face to face with over 200 Germans. The Americans had never experienced warfare like this before. Fighting the Germans in close quarters, they used their fist and rifle butts to attempt to repel the attack. After about 15 minutes, the Germans retreated. They took 11 Americans prisoner, including 2 officers. 3 Americans, James Gresham from Evansville, Indiana, Merrill D. Hay from Glydian, Iowa, and Thomas Enright were dead. Enright, who you can see he's up on the top of that poster, was not found until the next morning. His comrades determined that he had been captured, but refused to leave with the Germans and put up a fight. The Germans got the better of him in the end, cutting his throat from ear to ear. His chest was ripped open and there were 12 bayonet wounds on his body. The first 3 American casualties were buried with military honors in France. Thomas Enright would not come back to Pittsburgh until the 1920s. It was the Gazette-Times that christened Enright a martyr for democracy when reporting on his death on November 6, 1917. His poor sister didn't even know that he had been in France. When contacted by the press, she said that she was proud of her brother and that she knew that he would have wanted to die for democracy like he did. In their death, Enright, Gresham, and Hay became symbols for the Americans of democracy and of the great sacrifices of the war. They were all had similar backgrounds. They were all working class. They could have been anybody's son. And this is actually a poster that the American government used to raise money for the war. It says the first 3, give till it hurts, they gave till they died. They did not mince words during World War I. Thomas Enright did come back to Pittsburgh in 1921. He was taken to his sister's house, and from there he was laid in state in Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Hall in Oakland, where his funeral was celebrated by the Bishop of Pittsburgh, and this is actually his funeral procession outside of St. Paul's Cathedral in Oakland. The cathedral was packed. In death, Enright belonged to the city in a way that he never did in life. He was an outward symbol of Pittsburgh's pride, patriotism, and wartime sacrifice. Enright's final journey ended in St. Mary's Cemetery in Lawrenceville. Lastly, I'd like to conclude with these scenes from when the armistice was announced. It's really easy to forget World War I. It's often overshadowed by World War II, because World War II, let's be real, it's a lot easier to understand and it's a lot more good versus evil than World War I was. But to the people that lived through it, they didn't know that the Great Depression was coming. They didn't know that World War II was coming. This was supposed to be the be-all and end-all, the most important thing that they were ever going to see in their lives, the last and greatest war. And when it ended, after all of their struggles and all of their sacrifices, they took to the streets in celebration and had an impromptu parade. That's how important this was to them. And thank you so much for your time and attention. Does anybody have any questions?
You mentioned someone was, Alderdice was the head of this one organization. Who ran the Red Cross?
The Red Cross was run by a number of, in Pittsburgh it was run by a number of prominent Pittsburghers. They actually even wrote a book after the war about what they did during the war, and there are like hundreds of names in it. The top, I don't have the man's name off the top of my head, but it wasn't a name that I instantly recognized.
Thanks, Elizabeth. You mentioned, I guess, dissent by the German population. Pittsburgh certainly was active in labor and other influences, had a lot of Eastern European population. My question is, there were laws passed against socialists and communists. Was there much activity by socialists against the war, with any visits by people like Eugene Debs or Anne Goldman and there was Evangelical and Squirrel? How does Pittsburgh figure into that?
Oh, yes, well, Pittsburgh did have a relatively large socialist population given the labor force here. And they were active during the war. They were obviously very anti-war. I don't know if anybody came here off the top of my head, but I do talk about them a little bit in my book.
Okay.
There was an Enright Theater downtown.
Yes. That was named after Thomas Enright. The Enright Theater was named after Thomas Enright. And now Enright Court stands where, it's a street where the theater was. That was actually named after the theater and not the man.
There were so many, and I think a previous question asked about, mentioned of Eastern European groups that were, looking at different times to free themselves from, most particularly the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire too. But how did those groups react during the war? What can you tell us about their
I actually talk quite extensively about the Polish immigrants in Pittsburgh because we did have a large Polish population and we had a very nationally known Polish population, and they wanted their own unit of the American Army. And after Russia went communist, they actually did get that, and a lot of that work was done in Pittsburgh.
There? You mentioned that there wasn't so much nativist sentiment in Pittsburgh compared to other cities, even though we had a large German population. Why do you think that Pittsburgh escaped that kind of outburst in violence?
Well, there was definitely nativist sentiments here. The German community here was also so incredibly old and ingrained in Pittsburgh culture. I mean, Heinz was part of the U.S. Food Administration, and that is a German name. So I think that is part of the reason why, while there was this nativist sentiment, there wasn't the widespread violence that there was in cities like Chicago.
Didn't New York and Chicago have large German parties called the Bund, B-U-N-D?
I believe they did.
And weren't they active against the American cause going into the war? And wasn't there a lot of conflict because of the Bund?
I'm not familiar with that, but I do know that is World War II.
I think it's the Second War, at least.
That is,
yeah, I mean, they're very strong. They might have had some earlier roots, but that
now,
was
I do know that nationally and in Pittsburgh, there were German communities fighting against going into World War I. They really wanted American neutrality, America to stay neutral, simply because they didn't want to fight their countrymen. And when the United States did declare war, there was actually talk of rounding up the German population and putting them in concentration camps, or something like that, detention camps.
Do you know, the Bund had major influence in slowing down American involvement in World War II. Is the German community nationwide given credit for slowing down the involvement in World War I, or not as much?
I don't think as much, but I do know that, there was definitely the National German-American Alliance was very prominent in the fight, and Pittsburgh had a huge sector of it. It was very prominent in the fight to keep America neutral. And it actually campaigned very, very heavily against Woodrow Wilson when he ran for re-election.
But Wilson's slogan was, "He kept us out of war."
Yes.
In 1916.
They didn't believe he was going to do that if he got re-elected.
Liz, I'm Janine from the Meetup Group, and I'm almost done with your book. I'm enjoying it very much. One thing I find really fascinating, and I knew nothing about this, you talked about the university's involvement, and the story about the University of Pittsburgh and the field hospital that they built before the war even, before we got involved in the war. Could you talk about that a little bit? Because I thought that was such a fascinating story.
The University of Pittsburgh and several prominent Pittsburghers were even really early, even before America entered the war, they were anticipating America's entrance into the war. So they started raising money and putting together and training for a field hospital. That way, as soon as America entered the war in 1917, they could send it right over, and it actually beat the University of Pittsburgh's base hospital actually beat American troops to France. Yes?
How long those newspapers last, those short papers? How much more did they last? After World War I, or did they just stop?
I think they lasted up through the 20s and into the 30s. They might have lasted up until World War II.
That was it?
World War II, well, by the time World War II hit America, there was a lot more, the German-American community was quite a bit more assimilated than it had been in World War I. And like I said, by the 1920s in Pittsburgh, German surnames weren't even considered German, they were considered American. So you'll get a lot more, and actually, what's interesting is if you read the records of like the local German-American organizations, they were really, really concerned that their kids didn't care about the German ancestry anymore. They wanted to speak English and read American books, and they wanted to be assimilated. So they were, beginning to fight against that even before World War I happened.
Have you ever seen an estimate of the percentage of German Americans in the Pittsburgh population at this time?
I have. I can't, off the top of my head, bring it up, but
Was it more than 10%?
I think it was. We had a very, very large. We were, I think, one of the largest in the country.
Any other questions?
Yes.
As I researched Herder Cemetery, I learned that even back then, there was no Germany, but Germanic peoples were maybe, I think, the second largest ethnic group after the British Isles. So when did the majority of German immigrants come? I know that they assimilated sooner, but was it like 1840s, or were they, how much earlier were they?
I think the 1840s is when they started. That's when the major wave.
Yeah. It was after the failed revolution of 1848.
Yeah.
That's when there was a big immigration from the German states.
Any other questions?
Woodside had a German club.
I think they are.
They're still there. I was there for years.
I actually dated a guy that was part of that when I was in high school. So.
They go together. So someone on Woodside, they want.
Yes.
They had several German social clubs.
Should have heard it in later person.
When did you hear that question?
What?
What was the question?
Oh, he asked about the Teutonic Club on the north side and whether it still existed, and I said I'm pretty sure it does.
It's very active.
Yeah.
There are several German
Yes.
organizations, and every September they have a big to-do.
In Bloomfield, too, I understand.
In the Littertoffel.
Yes.
You haven't mentioned German Jews, who were also a big population in Pittsburgh, so how did they fit in?
Could you repeat the questions that are
She asked about the German Jewish population. I didn't look at them for my book. I just gave a very general overview. But I would imagine that they had similar views and were part of similar organizations to the German Gentile population. Anything else? Yes.
When did Boulevard of the Allies? Was that right after?
That was World War I.
And what street, was there a name on the street before that, or is there?
Off the top of my head, I don't know, but that was definitely where it was named for the Allies in World War I.
It was 42nd Avenue.
Second.
Oh, he asked what the Boulevard of the Allies was, and if it was World War I or World War II.
Thank you ever so much. A great deal has been put into this talk, and we appreciate it. A few things. Next month, Squirrel Hill Urban Coalition, they're going to talk about the organization. That is the organization that is sort of the informal government here. We'll talk about some of the new projects, and some of you wonder what's going on at the corner down here. We'll hear about that. But it turns out that the Jewish Federation had a great deal to do with the founding of the Urban Coalition, and that is a story we have not gotten previously, and they're preparing to talk about that. So that should be an interesting sidelight on that. Patty?
Don't forget the library.
We now have, thank you very much, we now have a regular exhibit up at the Squirrel Hill Library, which Helen and Betty, who's not here tonight, are responsible for manning. We're on our, I think, 4th exhibit now, 5th or 4th? 5th exhibit. We rotate every 2 months. This is the Squirrel Hill Museum in miniature. We now have a wonderful exhibit on the Morrowfield Hotel. I urge you to go by and see it. We also have some local books on Squirrel Hill there, and please go by and see that. And we're very proud. This started last year, and it's a key feature of this organization that I should have mentioned earlier. We have a tradition here that people cooperatively help us clear the chairs away at the end of the meeting, and there are stands over there to put it in if you would help us with that. I believe that concludes our business for tonight. Thank you for coming.